Hey, Elisa, how you guys doing? Um, the other day, crazy story. Some guy broke into my house, stole all my light bulbs. Just stole my light bulbs. You would think I'd be really angry about this, but instead, I'm delighted, delighted, delighted. Joke of the day. All right. Anyway, so for today, we're going to talk about labor unions. So for the last couple of classes, we've been kind of looking at big businessmen. So like Carnegie, Rockefeller, how they made their money. Oftentimes, they're making their money by basically treating their workers like garbage. Um, and so low pay, bad conditions, long hours, that type of stuff. And so the workers need to kind of have a voice in all this. And so they form a union. And so the union is supposed to speak for the workers. Um, and what you get is this then kind of like battle between management and the worker. And the American public is kind of like pulled in between this. So today we'll kind of look at that dynamic. So early labor unions, why they were successful or how they found success or why they weren't successful, the role of the public in all this and who they would side with is kind of what we're going to talk about today. So it's a little bit lengthy in terms of the note video, so I apologize for that. But yeah, on Friday we'll have our Google Zoom for the week, and Google Zoom. Look at me combining it all. So we'll have our Zoom for the week. On that one, we'll talk about the summer assignment. So your paper, you get to read the book, The Jungle. I'll probably invite Delana and Brigitte to class as well. So behave. Anyway, all right. Talk to you guys later. Be safe, be smart. Have a good one. Okay, so today we're going to start talking about organized labor. And so labor is just another way of saying worker. And so organized workers, basically the workers getting together, speaking as one voice, basically pushing back against people like the likes of Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, who we've been talking about. And so workers organizing, these are called unions. And so unions were, unfortunately for the workers, they were weak during this time period because it becomes a supply and demand type of situation. And so the way this would work is that workers would get together and they would find some inequity in the workplace. Either it would be the working conditions, safety, pay, number of hours, whatever it may be. And the thought was that if the workers band together and demanded as one voice a change, that the leverage they had was that they were the ones who were doing the work. So it's kind of like, hey, we want an extra, $2 an hour. And if you don't give us the $2 an hour, well, we're not going to work, right? That's kind of the logic, right? And them not working, that would be like a strike. Um, for that to be effective, you need leverage. And the thought is that if we're the workers, they need us. But this is also the same time period of all that massive amount of immigration that we were talking about last unit. So there's an endless supply of workers, which means the workers themselves don't have any leverage. So when the workers go to management and say, "Hey, we need $2 more an hour, or we're not going to work," the boss can say, "Fine," right? Fires all the workers and hire a bunch of immigrants, and those immigrants are looking desperately for work. You can give them even less pay. And so this was a problem with labor unions, that they just did the supply and demand immigration kind of worked against them. In terms of talking about unions in terms of factory environments, there are things called closed shops and open shops. So a closed shop means that every employee must belong to a union or must agree to have the union represent them in that work environment. An open shop is the opposite. Either labor unions are banned, or that there's no requirement that you join a union to work there. So, of course, workers want a closed shop, right? Giving them power, giving them a voice. And of course, management wants an open shop. And so, what are some of the conditions that we've been talking about here? So, again, during this time period, the average male wage, so a man working, was making between $10 and $12 a week for a 60 to 80 hour week. To give you an idea now, a typical week right now, by law, caps at 40 hours. Okay. So you cannot work more than a 40-hour week without getting overtime. And of course, that's a victory. The 40-hour week is something that labor unions were able to achieve. Women doing the same work were making $6 to $8 a week. So you see an inequity there. Um, the idea that Andrew Carnegie made $23 million in personal profit in 1900, his average worker got $500 a year, right? Part of the problems. And in 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt issued a study and found out that a quarter of the population, 1 out of every 4 people, was, quote, underfed, underclothed, and poorly housed. So this was a very difficult time to be a worker living in the United States. So unions were created to basically try to, amend this and fix this. So the first national organization for workers was something called the Knights of Labor. Um, and the Knights of Labor allowed any worker who wanted to join. Now they didn't want immigrants because they thought immigrants were part of the problem with workers, right? That immigrants were basically willing to work less, and again, that supply and demand thing we talked about. Um, but by allowing all workers in here and having a national agenda, saying this is what we want workers all throughout the United States to get, it didn't work. It was too big. Workers want different things, have different needs. And so as a result, the Knights of Labor kind of fell apart and failed. A next attempt, or a later attempt at organization, was something called the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, which was founded by Samuel Gompers, who you see on your screen there. And the AFL is still around today. And so the AFL, their difference was that they only represented skilled workers. And again, it goes back to this idea of leverage. So a skilled worker is someone that performs a job that you just can't get someone off the street to do, right? So before we talked about, well, if I don't get my $2 an hour, I'm gonna not work, right? And well, then I'll just find someone off the street to do the job. Here, though, you can't replace those people. Those people have to be, whoever you get in to do that job now has to be trained. There's going to be lag time. That gives the workers some form of leverage. The other thing which made them effective is that they did not have long-term national goals. So you would have the American Federation of Labor be very much concerned about the conditions in this factory. So maybe for this factory, it isn't so much how much they're getting paid, it's the working conditions. The machines are too dangerous. So the union will organize about making the machines safer. Maybe at a factory across town or in another state, it's about the salary. That there we need the $2 an hour. They were flexible, and they gave the workers the choice and the voice to say this is what we want and this is how we want to go about doing it. And as a result, they were they're quite effective to the point where they are still around today. But labor unions are not going to be popular, right? Because again, if workers get what they want, that eats into the bottom line of management, right? So if you give workers more money, if you have to spend money to make the factory safer, that's less profit for the owner. And that's the push and the pull, right? Every time a worker wins something, management feels like they're losing something, right? Every time management wins something, workers feel like they're losing something. At least that was the perception of the time. And so there's going to be a strong incentive for management to make sure that their workers do not organize. And there's going to be efforts by both groups to try to get the American public on their side. So today we're going to continue talking about labor unions, and in particular, the fact that they did not find much support with the American public. And so this is a PR game, right? The workers desperately want the support of the American people. And of course, management wants the support of the American people. And then you have the government also that gets involved with this. And you're going to see a pattern is going to happen, and that workers are going to become frustrated. We talked about last class, how they don't have a lot of leverage when it comes to fighting these battles with management because of so many immigrants being willing to work. So as these workers got frustrated as their strikes were not getting the results they wanted, the strikes would often turn violent. And in that violence, they would attack management's property. They would destroy machines. Um, factories themselves would be damaged. And the American public then viewed these workers as being violent. Um, Also add into the fact that a lot of these workers are lower class people. Some of these workers are immigrants themselves. You have that idea of nativism, which has been permeating at the same time, which we talked about last unit. All these things are going to combine to give people a real negative view of workers and labor unions. And so, if you think now between 1881 and 1905, there were 37,000 strikes in the country involving 7 million workers. And strikes, if effective, also impact the public. And so, you had strikes involving police departments, fire departments, um, postal workers went on strike. Um, People who worked for trains went on strike. And of course, if the mail can't get delivered, if there's fear that your garbage isn't going to get picked up, or if that supplies can't move around the country, this impacts people. And people then get upset and they get frustrated. Workers would hope they would side with the workers and say, all right, give the workers what they want and everything goes away. But more often, what you saw was that people and government respond with more violence, in which troops are then brought in, and you actually have fights happening between workers and the government. And so management saw this. They saw public opinion turning against the workers. And so they would look to capitalize on this by creating what were called yellow dog contracts. And so a yellow dog contract is something that a worker would be forced to sign, which basically would say they would promise never to join a union. And of course, if you get enough people to do this in a workplace, you then destroy the union, and there's no longer a union in that factory. An example of kind of what we've been talking about here, workers organizing and workers turning these protests turning violence, is the Haymarket Square riot, which occurred in 1886 in Chicago. And what you had was this was a massive street protest to basically coordinate around May Day, which is usually on May 1st. And May Day is still a holiday celebrated around the world. That's kind of like a Labor Day. Our government doesn't we don't celebrate May Day anymore because May Day is associated with communism in a lot of places and socialism. So we had to create our own holiday to celebrate workers, and so that's why it's Labor Day. But so you had all these workers gathering to kind of promote workers and promote their interests. Police respond. There's some pushing and shoving going on between the two groups. Police then fire into the crowd, killing 4 strikers. The next day, you now have the strikers return, but now they're angry, and they're angry at the police. So they come after the police, and a bomb is thrown at the police, and 7 police officers are killed and wounded. And so at that point, once the bomb is when the police start shooting, and what we have is just craziness and just anarchy, basically in Chicago. Eventually, 8 workers are arrested, and when it's discovered that they are German immigrants and they're anarchists, and anarchists are people who are against government, now all of a sudden workers and labor unions get painted with this broad brush that all labor unions are run by immigrants, all labor unions are anarchists, and so thus workers are radicals, not to be sided with and not to be trusted. And so unions had to respond to this. And so the AFL did as best they could to root out any anarchists, root out any troublemakers, and to try to kind of alleviate the fears of the country. But then you had another union created called the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, that kind of went the opposite route. It says, look, if they think we're going to be like radicals, if they think we're a bunch of like thugs, then we're going to be radicals and we're going to be thugs. And so the IWW was an aggressive union. They existed for a short period of time. Their biggest success was actually in Paterson, with a Paterson silk strike just after the turn of the century. But they were led by a man named Eugene Debs, who was a socialist. Debs would go on and run for the presidency several times as a socialist. And it was a union that, again, was rooted in this radical socialist kind of belief that all the workers needed to unite. They wanted to get rid of a basic wage system. in which you're working at an hourly rate, and instead go to salaries for all workers. And they want to do this through a general strike. And a general strike is when all workers, regardless of what it is you do, go on strike to support your fellow workers. So a general strike has the potential to shut down a country. Um, and their motto was that there can be no peace while hunger. Um, and so while the IWW was around briefly, they kind of became the manifestation of what people thought these labor unions were. So now people can say, see, I told you they were radical. See, I told you they were being run by a bunch of socialists. So the IWW, while in the short term gave workers a voice, and allowed them to kind of like be more aggressive, which is something workers wanted. But unfortunately, it fed into the stereotype that the American public already had.